Trump's rhetoric on NATO has caused major concern among European leaders. Do you see this as a negotiating tactic, or is the US genuinely shifting away from traditional security commitments?
Good evening. Thanks for your invitation. Yes, the recent developments with regard to the negotiations with regard to conflict in Ukraine, they seem to indicate an important shift, a significant shift, not just in diplomacy, but more generally as well in the international order. And for such type of conflict occurring in Europe, we would expect European countries, especially European countries supporting Ukraine, to be invited. But it's not the case, and it seems to indicate what some experts call, with regard to EU countries, a form of diplomatic irrelevance. And it's very surprising, especially as well with regard to France, to not be part of these negotiations, or even as well for Switzerland. It's not an EU country, but Switzerland usually, by tradition, hosts important negotiations with regard to conflicts, as it was the case for Syria, for the previous phases of the Ukrainian conflict.
Now, European leaders are now discussing the need for an independent defense force. Do you think Europe is ready for this, or are divisions among EU nations are too deep?
Well, you're right. First of all, there are divisions. We know that Slovakia, Hungary, for example, or Italy as well, to some extent, are quite reluctant to provide more support for the war to Ukraine. Even Poland is reluctant to send troops in Ukraine, while Emmanuel Macron, the French president, said that he would like to send troops there. So we have divisions in Europe. Sure, it's not very helpful if EU countries want to have a common position in negotiations. And you have as well a meeting summoned by Emmanuel Macron, and France and other EU countries are rather opposing peace negotiations, and they are rather signaling their will to continue to support the Ukrainian war effort. So it's not going to be very, very helpful for European countries if they want to have an influence in the negotiations with regard to the conflict in non-European countries seem to be more important. If I may, when I was mentioning non-European countries, I'm mentioning countries like China or Saudi. Well, that we have a kind of diplomatic shift happening.
But do you think will they be able to have an independent defense force?
That's a very old question as well in the European Union, in the history of European construction. There were previous attempts that failed, like the European Community of Defense. And there were different attempts as well to strengthen the defense capacities of EU as a whole. You already have agreements, you have cooperation, but once again, when it comes to have a real strategic independence, because it would go as well with go with the attempt to build an independent or strategic military force in Europe. It's not there. You have these agreements in EU countries, among EU countries, about strategic goals or the strategic interests. First of all, about their national interests that are not necessarily the same, and as well, what would constitute a kind of EU national or strategic interest. So you have divisions among European countries, and moreover, you have a problem of resource. Many EU countries need to commit more resources, not just to NATO, but to the buildup or the strengthening of the capacities of their armed forces. So it's going to be a huge challenge, and I think right now, even though France would like to build such kind of new defense community in the EU, I'm not sure there will be something really tangible, especially as most EU countries are NATO members. And you have the Berlin Plus agreement of 2003 stating that for defense capacities, for EU defense capacities, you have cooperation with NATO. And in fact, it's not just a cooperation, because most defense and security issues are between the hands of NATO and not really in the hands of the European Union.